All right, we've been talking about it all week long, right? We're heading into the fantasy playoffs, and this is the time of year that you start your studs and let them carry you to fantasy championships. But there's also a little bit of luck involved, right? That's how fantasy football is, so we're going to try something different here. Leading into this episode, I'm going to call upon the fantasy gods to tell us who this week's number one overall wide receiver is going to be, to give us all a little bit of a heads up. All I got to do is snap my fingers, the jersey appears in the locker. You ready? Here we go. 3, 2. Ain't that some shit? What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there. Welcome Week 14 Fantasy Football, heading into the playoffs, and we're talking about them ball catchers. That's right, the wide receiver position here for Week 14. Who should we start and who should we sit? Do we take some risks? Do we play it safe? That's what we're going to be talking about here in this episode today. Now, before you troll me down below in the comment section, no, I do not have Corey Davis as my number one ranked wide receiver. A little bit of fun there. But there are a few guys who have some tough matchups and maybe some surprise wide receivers once again this week. So before we head into Week 14, let's go back to Week 13. Let's see how we did for the wide receiver position. Overall, a really solid week 13 for the wide receiver position. Had a total of 69 wide receivers that we gave a start or sit designation to that completed their games this past week. Out of those 69, 43 were correct for an accuracy percentage of 62%, which I will absolutely take. Why is that? We'll look at some of the big name misses that I didn't even include here that are basically must-starts for a lot of people out there. You have the likes of Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Tyler Lockett, Odell Beckham, Tyreek Hill, Michael Thomas, DJ Chark, all these guys, these big name guys that were started last week that absolutely missed and did not hit that double-digit cutoff. So that affects this percentage. So I'll take 62% all day long. Some of the hits, Devontae Parker, we called a Bigfoot sighting. He showed up, had a huge game. Robert Woods out there catching all them balls last week. He's definitely somebody who was in the hit column here, especially if you had him in full-point PPR leagues. Congratulations. Anthony Miller had him as a start on Thanksgiving Day. He popped off. Cole Beasley, revenge game against the Cowboys. He played great. And Alshon Jeffrey with arguably his best game of the season this past week. Some of the biggest misses? Yep, I'll own up to it. Kenny Golladay. I had him as a sit last week. I didn't like the situation. A third-string quarterback in his first NFL start going up against a difficult Chicago secondary. I just wasn't feeling it. And really, that 75-yard touchdown to start the game off for them on their first drive is what made him a miss. You take that away, he's in the hit column. Cortland Sutton, another guy, started off with a rookie quarterback there, Drew Lock, in his first start, matched up with Casey Hayward and the Chargers. Didn't like the matchup. He scored 2 touchdowns. He was a miss. Alan Lazard, he got in the end zone. He was a miss for us last week. Curtis Samuel, also another guy that we did not have as a start last week. And then Zach Pascal, hadn't really done a whole lot consistently all season long. With all that added volume last week, came out, had a great game. He was another miss. But now we're heading into Week 14 for the wide receiver position. There's, like I said, there's a lot of difficult choices to make. And it's a critical time of the year, right? It's the playoff time. So let's get into some of the Week 14 matchups, but don't get overly involved with what column these guys are in. I say this every single show, just as a reminder. Take the information, apply it to your league, make these decisions yourself. That's what we're trying to do, make these decisions a little bit easier. So with all that being said, let's head into Week 14, and who are we starting and sitting for the wide receiver position? Thursday Night Football, Cowboys and Bears up first, and we dodged a bullet last week with Amari Cooper. Went down with a knee injury, but he seems to be fine. The knee is okay. Already back at practice, a full practice participant here, already here this week. Should be good to go for Thursday. He's had some difficult matchups the past few weeks, right? He's had matchups against Darius Slay, Stephon Gilmore, Tre'Davious White. And now this week, the Chicago Bears are going to be without one of their top cover corners in Prince Amukamara, which is also pretty fun to say, if I'm being completely honest here. Now, does that mean that we see a lot more Amari Cooper being covered by Kyle Fuller? And it's entirely possible, but with some of the matchups as of late, Cooper has proven that he can still be a solid floor plate. Is that ceiling always going to be there? No, maybe not, but he's a decent option here again this week. Michael Gallup is also somebody who gets some extra looks because if Kyle Fuller is shadowing Amari Cooper, that could open up some coverage for Michael Gallup. We kind of saw last week that, they did not shadow Amari Cooper the entire game. It just depends how the defense wants to play it here, being without one of their top cornerbacks. But for Michael Gallup, he could really use some more volume. We saw him get a lot more double-digit target games earlier in the season. He's only had 6 targets each of his last 2 games, and now Randall Cobb, somebody who'd been playing great, is kind of losing some of those targets also. He only had 3 targets total last week. I mean, I really expect Dallas to come out and try to get something going early. I expect them to establish Ezekiel Elliott and that run game as early as possible and try to get that going so it opens up the passing game down the field. It's easier to run on the Bears than it is to throw on them. This is just one of those games that has some risk in it. Yeah, I'm going to start Amari Cooper. I think Randall Cobb may be the next safest option, just based off of volume in a PPR league. If you're in a PPR league, I think Randall Cobb sees a better opportunity here because that slot corner is going to have to move to the outside with no Prince Amukamara. That could give easier coverage for Randall Cobb across the middle. It may not be one of those huge yardage games, but he could rack up some receptions, and I think Randall Cobb's going to be a little bit safer for us this week. I have Michael Gallup as a sit. I don't dislike Michael Gallup. I just don't see all 3 of these guys having great games, and Michael Gallup may be big play touchdown dependent here, not as safe quite as Cooper or Cobb. That's why he's over there in the sit column. Don't overly dislike him whatsoever. So if he's one of your only options you have, I don't hate throwing him there in the lineup. Now, for the Chicago Bears, we got Allen Robinson and what maybe was my call of the week last week, Anthony Miller. There's no more Taylor Gabriel here this week. He's already been ruled out. And despite Dallas only allowing 18.5 fantasy points per game, I'm still going to fire up both of these guys here once again. Allen Robinson has back-to-back games with 10-plus targets, at least 6-plus receptions, and 86-plus yards and a touchdown. The guy is playing great. Mitch Trubisky looks improved over the past couple of weeks, and Allen Robinson is the main beneficiary of that. Now, last week, he had 8 catches for 86 yards against Darius Slay. A great matchup there for him, and he went out there and produced once again. But what about Anthony Miller? Can he do this again? Can he do what we saw last week where he had 9 catches for 140 yards? I don't know if we see that much, but I still think he's a solid start here once again this week. He's going to be matched up with Dallas defensive back Jordan Lewis, who last week got torched by the Beasles and Cole Beasley in Buffalo. We saw what happened there. He has allowed double-digit fantasy points to the receivers in which he's guarding 6 out of the last 7 games he's played. I'll start Anthony Miller here once again in Week 14. Panthers and Falcons up now, and the biggest question mark here is, does Julio Jones play? I mean, he's limited in practice. He missed last week. This is something we're really going to have to pay attention to into the weekend. We'd like to see him get a full practice in before the week is over. If he plays, how limited is he? That's where it becomes really difficult because if he plays, Russell Gage kind of loses some fantasy viability. If Julio Jones sits, Russell Gage is all of a sudden in play as a possible flex start, and especially in those 12-team leagues or larger. For right now, though, Calvin Ridley, the safer option of anybody right now in Atlanta. He's had 24 targets over the past 4 weeks and is playing great in the absence, I guess you could say, of Julio Jones, with him being somewhat limited there with the injuries. Calvin Ridley's going to remain in the start column. Julio, wait and find out. Wait and see. Let's see what these reports say going into the weekend. Russell Gage, really dependent on Julio before we decide which column for sure he falls in. Now for Carolina, is there a hotter receiver right now in the NFL than DJ Moore? I mean, over the last 5 weeks of the season, he's wide receiver 2 in fantasy football and half-point PPR scoring, averaging right around 18 fantasy points per game. Over that stretch, he's also averaging at least 9 targets and at least 6 receptions. Now there's a new coach in town, no more Ron Rivera. Shouldn't change the play calling too much, and we know Kyle Allen is going to look the way of DJ Moore a lot. But what about Curtis Samuel? In my opinion, he's a lot more touchdown dependent. He hasn't had more than 4 receptions in a game since week 3. That's a problem because if he doesn't find the end zone, he's not getting enough volume to give you that safe floor. Makes him a higher risk, especially right here in the playoffs. Now, Atlanta does allow 25.1 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 9th most in the NFL. So DJ Moore is going to be another wide receiver that I love here in Week 14. Colts and Bucks up now in another week with no T.Y. Hilton, it looks like, for the Indianapolis Colts. Heck, they're also without Eric Ebron, Paris Campbell. Chester Rogers is even out now, leaving really only at the wide receiver position Zach Pascal and Marcus Johnson, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. I mean, that's such a great matchup, though. They're going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary, which gives up, on average, 31.3 fantasy points per game. That's the most in the NFL. Now, Zach Pascal has not been a model of consistency at all. However, this week, I expect the volume to be there. One of the biggest things that Tampa Bay has going for it is its run defense. They could struggle running the ball in Indianapolis this week, and that could lead to more throwing in the passing game. Expect a lot of Jack motherfucking Doyle And probably a lot of Zach Pascal, once again, who had himself a great game last week. He's more of a low-end flex play here if you're looking for somebody in Week 14. A great DFS play, though, in my opinion, here this week. Now, for Tampa Bay, you got Evans and Godwin, who both had a disappointing week last week at a very inopportune time. Both of them only with 4 receptions, right around 50 yards, 7 fantasy points, and half-point PPR scoring. Not ideal. However, you can't afford to sit these guys at this point of the season. It's the playoffs. You're trying to make it to the next round, to the championship, whatever it is that you're trying to get to. These guys can single-handedly get you there on any given Sunday. Can't afford to sit them because if you do and they go off, you'll never let yourself forget it. Dolphins and Jets now, and basically at this point, fantasy Bigfoot Devontae Parker has kind of turned into that old school movie version of Harry and the Hendersons. Do you remember that movie? It's a movie where like a Sasquatch-looking dude moves in with a suburban family. That's kind of what's happening with Devontae Parker because we're starting to see frequent sightings all the time from Devontae Parker. Over the last 5 weeks, he's wide receiver 5 in fantasy football. He's had 10-plus targets in his last 4 games, and he's playing with great confidence right now. Miami, they're number 7 in the NFL when it comes to pass attempts per game, averaging over 40 pass attempts each and every week. A lot of the times because they're trailing and they're being forced to throw the ball. There is no other main wide receiver in this offense to take away this volume from Devontae Parker, and the Jets allow almost 25 fantasy points per game. Bust out your video cameras again because there's about to be another Bigfoot sighting in Week 14. But what about the Jets side of things? What has happened to Jamison Crowder? Like, where did he go? Dude vanished. He's got 4 receptions, 26 yards, and no touchdowns over his last 2 games combined. But Miami gives up on average 5 receptions and 60 yards per game to slot wide receivers. Crowder, he was wide receiver 10 in Week 9 when these two teams played each other just a few short weeks ago. Now, Robbie Anderson, though, is really the guy who, as of late, has been the guy to own. Over the last 2 weeks, he's been wide receiver 15 overall. He's seen 15 targets, 11 receptions, 187 yards, and a touchdown. Miami has shown that they're pretty vulnerable on the outside. Look what Alshon Jeffrey did to them last week, and look no further than Robbie Anderson. Now, you see him highlighted in yellow. He is a very high risk. Why? He can go out there and get you 1 catch for 8 yards. However, he can also go out there and get you 5 catches for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns in the blink of an eye. High risk, high reward. I like the matchup. I like the volume as of late. It's not a slam dunk, but if you have room for a little bit of risk, Robbie Anderson may be your guy. Niners and Saints up next, and last week, Michael Thomas came out and proved that he was actually human. Yeah, he only had 6 catches for 48 yards. Very for Michael Thomas, so hopefully he got it out of his system, and he can bounce back here in Week 14 in what is a very difficult matchup going up against San Francisco and Richard Sherman. Slight injury scare for Richard Sherman. Didn't know if he'd be limited at all this week. Nope, he's already back at practice, a full participant, and good to go this weekend. But you never sit Michael Thomas, like, ever. Yeah, it's bad timing for this matchup, but this guy can put up points on anybody any given week. He's in your starting lineup, and he's the only guy that I trust in New Orleans. But for San Francisco, ever since the return of George Kittle, the wide receiver production's kind of taken a hit, and the usage and volume is all over the place. I mean, take Deebo Samuel, for example. I don't think anybody would argue that he'd been their best wide receiving option here over the last 5 or 6 weeks. But in the last 2 games combined, only 6 targets. 4 receptions, but he's turned it into 91 yards and 2 touchdowns, so it's kind of masking the fact that he's not getting a lot of volume. What happens if those touchdowns aren't there? All of a sudden, Deebo Samuel is nowhere near your starting lineup. And Emmanuel Sanders, he's getting healthier and healthier each and every week from that rib injury that he had just a few weeks ago. Now, the Saints allow a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers, 25.2 to be exact. There's just no for sure here. In this case, I'll go after the volume, the potential volume. The safer option to me is Emmanuel Sanders here this week. Deebo Samuel needs to find the end zone in order to be a solid start. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't hate Deebo Samuel because he's proven he can find the end zone and be a big playmaker. But it really depends on how much risk is in your lineup. If you're already having a lot of risk, maybe you don't want to risk it even more with Deebo Samuel. If you have a rock-solid lineup and you can afford to take a little risk, that's when Deebo Samuel becomes an option for you and your fantasy team here in Week 14. Lions and Vikings up now, and it's looking like another week with no Adam Thielen for the Minnesota Vikings. So what does that mean for Stephon Diggs, right? He's been struggling here as of late. In fact, he's had single-digit fantasy production 3 out of the last 4 games. Now, in those 3 games combined, he only has 8 receptions for 78 yards and no touchdowns. So he's really been hurting a lot of fantasy rosters here of late. But he's already faced this defense once this season, back in week 7, where he had 7 receptions for 142 yards. Yes, he's big play dependent and touchdown dependent. He's not much of a red zone threat here for the Minnesota Vikings. That's more of like Kyle Rudolph at this point. But Detroit allows 25.4 fantasy points per game. And yes, he'll draw Darius Slay at times. However, he's proven that he doesn't need a lot of volume to get you that production. If he's 100% healthy, there's a slight injury scare with him last week. Also, he was down on the field at the same time Dalvin Cook was. He came back into the game. He looked fine on tape, but didn't really do anything after that. So something to monitor here. But if you're looking for a high-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2, Stephon Diggs is here this week in week 14. But now we get on to the Detroit Lions, and a lot of people want to talk about how upset they were that I didn't like Kenny Golladay last week. And you're right, I didn't. And he was one 75-yard touchdown to start the game away from ending the game with 3 catches for 83 yards and us being correct about it. Can we count on 75-yard touchdowns on a weekly basis? No, we can't. And we know that David Blau is going to be back under center once again. He started off hot. In their first 2 drives, he went down and scored touchdowns with Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay. But after that, was really held in check, and they seem to really pick up on some of his tendencies. That's what kind of has me worried a little bit this week. There's tape on him now for the opposing defenses to study. Do they limit him this entire week? It's possible. There is risk involved here. I have Kenny Golladay as a start this week because obviously he doesn't need a whole lot of volume. But there's a lot of risk here, especially with Marvin Jones, because he's not seen the volume. He's strictly touchdown dependent at this point. He hasn't seen large volume almost at all this entire season, at least since Matthew Stafford has gone out. Neither one of these guys I'm looking forward to starting here in week 14. And it's because of the quarterback situation. It has nothing to do with their talent-wise. So if you have to start one of these guys, just be prepared. There's that opportunity, there's that chance that they really struggle if David Blau, the quarterback that you've probably never heard of until last week, struggles out the gate here this week. Broncos and Texans up now, and the schedule makers of the NFL must hate me this week because now I get to talk about Courtland Sutton, my next biggest miss of week 13 here back-to-back. But last week, the Chargers defense had Derwin James back. Casey Hayward was supposed to be shadowing Courtland Sutton. And really, for the entire game, Sutton only had 4 catches. The problem is, 2 of them were for touchdowns. One of them was a ridiculous circus catch. The guy is for real. And I wasn't, doubting Courtland Sutton. It was more of the quarterback play. But now that we've seen Drew Lock play, I liked what I saw from him on tape. He wasn't, overly patient, but that was his first NFL start. We need to give him some time. But it's obvious he's trying to get the ball towards Courtland Sutton, especially in the red zone, and that's what we're looking for here this week. Houston allows almost 24 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and there is no really other big threat for the Denver Broncos as far as pass catchers go. Courtland Sutton is option number 1, and that's going to be who I start for the Broncos here this week in a game in which I expect them to have to throw the ball. For Houston, we know we're starting DeAndre Hopkins regardless, right? Difficult matchup for him, though. He's going to draw Chris Harris majority of the time, but we started him last week against Stephon Gilmore. We're going to do the same thing this week once again and keep our fingers crossed. So that really leaves us with Kenny Stills and Will Fuller. What do we do here? Both of them have ridiculously high ceilings. However, both of them have ridiculously low floors also. Will Fuller had a touchdown called back this past week. What was it, the next play or two? It was a touchdown pass to Kenny Stills. So the points came off the board for Fuller. They went to Stills. It's really hard to pick which one of these guys is really going to go off on a weekly basis. Now, it's already popped up on the injury reports this week that Will Fuller is dealing with hamstring tightness once again, the same hamstring that he's dealt with for feels like ever. So if there's a chance that Will Fuller sits, Kenny Stills becomes a start for me here this week because Denver's really vulnerable in the slot. So if both of these guys are playing, that's where we'd like to focus. The problem is both of these guys share the slot, and they're there about 25 to 30% of the time, so we can't really nail one of them into that, direct position. That's what makes this just so difficult. So as of right now, DeAndre Hopkins and Will Fuller. If Fuller is limited or out at all, Kenny Stills becomes the guy that I would rather start in his place here this week. Ravens and Bills up now, and a lot of people maybe to begin the season weren't looking forward to this matchup, but little did they know, this would be one of the best matchups of the week come week 14. And as exciting as Baltimore is to watch, it's really hard to trust their wide receivers. I mean, over the last 3 games, Marquise Hollywood Brown has 8 receptions, 66 yards, and 2 touchdowns, both of which came in the same game, the same half against the Los Angeles Rams. And more than likely, he's going to be shadowed by Tre'Davious White this week, the number 5 ranked defensive back in the NFL. So you take into account the lack of volume he's seen, a tough matchup, their ability to run the ball in Baltimore, the tight end production, because I mean they're option number 1 outside of the running game. I'm really not willing to risk it this week on Marquise Brown or Willie Snead for the Baltimore Ravens. For Buffalo, though, you have John Brown and Cole Beasley. Boy, am I glad I got Beasley right last week. I would have gotten a lot of hate here going back to back misses, but loved Beasley last week, especially the revenge game narrative was part of it, but the volume has really been there for him. But this is a very tough matchup for both of these guys. I mean, the Baltimore secondary, you have Marcus Peters, Marlon Humphrey, Jimmy Smith, you got Earl Thomas back there playing safety. I mean, this is not a secondary which you look forward to playing against. Now, John Brown has 4 touchdowns in his last 3 games. The problem, he only has 5 total receptions over his last 2 games. Beasley, a little bit safer at this point, but he draws Marlon Humphrey, who's one of the top-ranked slot corners in all of the NFL, so it's not going to be a walk in the park for him either. I expect them to have to throw the ball in this game. They're not going to just be able to run back and forth against the Baltimore Ravens. They're going to have to try to move the ball more quickly because Baltimore's going to try to run the clock like they do every single week. In my opinion, Cole Beasley's a little bit safer, especially in PPR leagues. He may not get huge numbers like we saw last week, but if the volume can be there and he can rack up 6 or 7 receptions for 60, 70 yards as a flex play here in week 14, kind of gives you that safe floor. John Brown, more touchdown dependent, more of a standard league option because the volume just hasn't been there consistently as of late, and that's the only thing that worries me here heading into the fantasy playoffs. Cincinnati and Cleveland up now, and we talked about it on this episode last week, right? What was the return of Andy Dalton going to do to the wide receivers here in Cincinnati? Well, we saw it right off the bat last week with Tyler Boyd. He saw 10 targets. That's the most targets he's seen in a game since week 7, when the quarterback was who? Yep, Andy Dalton. So now Tyler Boyd has back-to-back weeks with touchdowns and starting to take some momentum here into the second half of the season. John Ross also comes back this week. How limited is he going to be in his first game back? That still is, remains to be seen, but at least Tyler Boyd's going to spend 60% of his time in the slot, especially now if they have John Ross and Auden Tate on the outside to draw away defensive coverage. It could only open up the field more for Tyler Boyd. I love him here this week. Now, for Cleveland, you kind of have to start Odell Beckham, and you want to start Jarvis Landry at this point, right? Because Jarvis Landry is just straight feasting. He is wide receiver 1 in fantasy football over the last 5 weeks. The guy is just getting ridiculous volume. The touchdown upside has been there. He's been their true number 1 target in this offense. Odell Beckham, yes, he's hurt you. And can you really afford to sit him in a game like this? I don't think you really can. Yeah, the ceiling is somewhat limited. The floor is still not what you want it to be, but it's another one of those opportunities where if you bench him and he goes off this week in a matchup against Cincinnati, you're going to hate yourself for it. So just keep him in your lineup, throw him at your wide receiver too, keep your fingers crossed, and hopefully he has a big game. Redskins and Packers up now, and hey, do you guys all remember, like back in the day when Terry McLaurin was a thing? Yeah, I kind of miss it. I mean, the first 6 weeks of the season, Terry McLaurin was wide receiver 10 in fantasy football. Since week 6, he's wide receiver 69. And no, that's not a good thing. I mean, Dwayne Haskins has basically killed the majority of the upside for Terry McLaurin and made him really hard to trust. Put that on top of Green Bay being a top 10 defense against opposing wide receivers. Love the talent, but I'm not risking it here in the fantasy playoffs with either Terry McLaurin or Kelvin Harmon. For the Packers, you got Devontae Adams, who you're obviously going to start every single week. He's seen double digits in every single game target-wise since he's returned from injury. But what about after him? Allen Lazard? A lot of people like Allen Lazard. They see the production on paper, but he only had 3 catches. But he turned it into 103 yards and a touchdown. But this guy has only had more than 3 receptions in a game twice all year and has never had more than 6 targets in a game. The volume just isn't there to make him safe. If you're looking for a high-risk play with some high upside, then yeah, Allen Lazard may be your guy. Is he somebody that you can trust wholeheartedly going into Week 14, though? No, he's not. He just doesn't see enough volume. Plus, I don't expect the Packers to have to throw the ball all 4 quarters here. They get a lead in the second half. Maybe they just pound it with Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams, which only limits the upside even more of Allen Lazard. In my opinion, he's just too big of a risk. I'm just sticking with Devontae Adams here this week. Chargers and Jags up now, and Mike Williams continues to go down the street of getting a lot of yardage, but no touchdowns. Heck, right now, he's averaging over 20 yards per reception. That's number one in the NFL, but the problem is he's just too big play dependent. Only once since week 7 has he had more than 4 receptions in a game. Big play, big chunks of yardage. The touchdowns haven't been there, makes him a huge risk. Now, Keenan Allen, he continued his double-digit fantasy production scoring here to 3 weeks this past week. He's had back-to-back games with touchdowns now. He's had 10-plus targets 4 out of the last 6 games he's played. Give me, Keenan Allen over Mike Williams every day of the week right now. Phillip Rivers doesn't look like old-school Phillip Rivers, but at least Keenan Allen has that safer floor. You don't want to be super dependent on Mike Williams to get those big plays here in Week 14. But for the Jacksonville Jaguars, similar to Terry McLaurin, you guys remember DJ Chark? I remember here just a few weeks ago on this show, I was having arguments with viewers because I called the guy touchdown dependent, and it pissed everybody off. Now, nobody really wants to start him, but you may want to here going back because Gardner Minshew is back under center for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And with Gardner Minshew as his quarterback, DJ Chark was wide receiver 6 the first 9 weeks of the season. Now, he may draw Casey Hayward, which is a difficult matchup, yes, but Cortland Sutton proved last week that you can score on Casey Hayward. So DJ Chark has that touchdown upside once again this week. Dede Westbrook, another guy who's kind of shown to be the next option here in this offense. With Gardner Minshew under center, he averaged 8 targets a game, which kind of puts him in that safe floor, that low-end flex play on a weekly basis. The touchdown upside isn't really there for Dede Westbrook, but if you're in a full-point PPR league, even a half-point PPR league, he offers a safe floor on a weekly basis, can go out there, get 6 catches for 60 yards, right around that, and give you a solid fantasy day. He's not going to blow the doors off of anything, had a decent week last week, but he's the next in line here for somebody who I think has a safe play for Week 14. Steelers and Cardinals up now, and it sounds like another week without Juju Smith-Schuster of the Pittsburgh Steelers, but at this point, I think a lot of the owners have moved on anyway, so I don't think it's affecting too many people, but what that does mean is we're still in the middle of James Washington season. Yeah, the guy's got 90-plus yards and a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games, and this is a great matchup for him going up against the Arizona Cardinals, who allow 25.4 fantasy points per game, 6th most in the NFL. Now, when you look at it on paper, it looks like a difficult matchup going up against Patrick Peterson, but don't worry, this isn't the same old Patrick Peterson that you're used to seeing. The guy has been getting torched all year long in the games that he's been playing. Love James Washington here once again this week. That big playability gives him that high upside, and the volume gives him the safe floor. Now, for the Cardinals, you got Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. Larry Fitzgerald, more of, the old reliable type. He's the guy that's going to go out there and get you 8 to 10 fantasy points on a weekly basis. Not going to be overly flashy. Touchdown upsides kind of disappeared. Just a safe play. If you're in a multiple flex league, start 3 or more wide receivers. He becomes a solid option there for you. But that ceiling just isn't really there. But Christian Kirk is somebody who I'm very interested in here this week. A lot of people look at the last couple of weeks and say, man, this guy's totally fallen off. Well, he's played against Richard Sherman and Jalen Ramsey the past 2 weeks. Very difficult matchups. I expect a little bit more this week from Christian Kirk. Look what Jarvis Landry did against this team the past 2 times they've played each other. Jarvis Landry has been effective against the Steelers. That's the same type of role that we're going to see Christian Kirk in here this week, and I expect them to look for him a lot in this offense, trying to move the ball down the field. The Cardinals have a chance in this game to go out there and beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. A home game, I expect a lot of Christian Kirk, and I'm going to start him here this week. Titans and Raiders up now, and this one's going to be a little bit quick. Nobody on either one of these teams has shown any consistency on a week-to-week basis. Are they capable of having big games? Yes. Is there a chance that one of these guys has a big game this week? Yes. There's also a very big chance that all 3 of them do nothing at all. That's not the type of risk that I want to take here in Week 14. The big playability is probably mostly there for A.J. Brown at this point, but it's not consistent enough to really count on. None of these guys are seeing consistent targets on a weekly basis. The offense overall for Oakland has been struggling. Tyrell Williams was touchdown dependent to start the season. Now the touchdowns have disappeared. He's basically disappeared fantasy-wise. Corey Davis is non-existent at this point. It's kind of why he was the joke at the beginning of the video. Not somebody you can trust. And A.J. Brown just too hit or miss. I'm passing on everybody here in this game. Chiefs and Patriots up now in a battle of two defenses that don't give up very much to opposing wide receivers. I mean, these two pass defenses right now, New England's number 1 as far as fantasy points allowed per game with only 13.3. Kansas City, they're number 3, only allowing 17 fantasy points per game. So if it's not a name Julian Edelman for the New England Patriots, I'm really not interested at this point. There's a lot of talent there. There's been a lot of hype around a lot of these guys. It looked like Mohamed Sanu was going to be the guy when he first got to New England, opposite of Julian Edelman, but he's kind of disappeared since that game. Philip Dorsett's been battling with injuries. He's not consistent. N'Keal Harry, when these guys went down, we thought it was going to be time for him to take over. He didn't do a whole lot. And now you see Tom Brady getting frustrated on the sidelines. What is that going to do? It's going to make him rely a lot more on Julian Edelman and James White in the passing game. I expect to see a lot of those guys here in Week 14. The only two which I'll start here for the New England Patriots. Now for Kansas City, yes, this is absolutely horrible timing for Tyreek Hill owners to go up against Stephon Gilmore. I get it. But we started DeAndre Hopkins last week and it worked out. Were we counting on a passing touchdown from DeAndre Hopkins? No, but you only need one play for Tyreek Hill to go out there and give you a solid fantasy day. That's all you need is one deep play, and we're begging you for it. Please, Tyreek Hill this week, though. Similar to New England, outside of Tyreek Hill in Kansas City, a lot of the wide receivers you just don't trust. You just don't see enough of them consistently enough. Sammy Watkins, Mecole Hardman, heck, Demarcus Robinson. Nobody else out there not named Hill or Kelsey is really being involved. And nobody that I really want to take a risk at this point of the fantasy season. I'd hate to lose in the fantasy playoffs because I took a bold lottery guess on one of these other wide receivers here in this matchup. Seahawks and Rams up now, battle of the NFC West. And where the F is Tyler Lockett gone? I mean, like, where did he go? He has 4 combined receptions over his last 3 games total. I mean, has he become too hard to trust at this point? I mean, DK Metcalf's starting to see more work. He's had at least 6 receptions in the game, 3 out of the last 4 weeks. Josh Gordon isn't overly involved in this offense as of yet. Does Jalen Ramsey shadow DK Metcalf? If that's the case, maybe things open up for Tyler Lockett again this week. It's a gamble. Yes, the volume and the production, it hasn't been there. But if Ramsey's on the outside with Metcalf or Gordon, either or, that could open up the middle of the field for Tyler Lockett. I'm taking the risk myself this week. I'm starting Tyler Lockett in a matchup in which I think he can definitely bounce back in, especially if the Rams offense looks like it did last week against Arizona. If they can continue to move the ball down the field and score points, they're going to have to throw the ball in Seattle. I like Tyler Lockett this week, even though he's been a disappointment as of late. For the Rams, what has gotten into Robert Woods? Dude has gone like crazy and continues to eat on a weekly basis. Over his last 3 games, 39 targets. Are you kidding me? 26 receptions and 364 yards in 3 games. That makes him not touchdown dependent. That volume gives him that safe floor, especially in PPR leagues. Now, Cooper Kupp, he's seeing less targets. Why? Because they're all going to Robert Woods, apparently. And Cooper Kupp still hasn't had more than 65 yards receiving in the last 4 weeks. However, found the end zone last week. That helped out. They're going to have to continue to get him involved. Right now, Brandon Cooks is basically non-existent. Also because Robert Woods is taking all of the targets. I love Robert Woods again this week. I'll start him. And Cooper Kupp, one of these guys that's taken a big hit in value. But I'm going to start once again also as a low-end wide receiver too. I think that solid floor should be there. Just not the high ceiling that we saw to start the season. Giants and Eagles here, Monday Night Football, and it's the return of Eli Manning. Yay. I mean, who does it really help? Probably the most Saquon Barkley, to be honest. A lot of checkdowns going his way. It boosts his possible upside. What about Golden Tate? He's been maybe the most consistent wide receiver all season, but he's never even played a game with Eli before. The chemistry is there with Sterling Shepard and Eli Manning. They've played together for a few years. Maybe he gets the bump in volume. Does Evan Ingram come back this week? There's a good chance that may happen also. I mean, as of right now, Golden Tate, Sterling Shepard, I put them over Darius Slayton. I think they're safer plays, but they're not safe plays, if you know what I mean, overall. You know, if you want to throw them in your flex spot, if you start multiple flex players, then they become a little bit more of an option. I think the touchdown upside may be there a little bit more for Golden Tate. The volume-wise, a little bit more there for Sterling Shepard. Just really depends what you have in your lineup. There is risk with both these guys, but those are the two that I would take a shot at. It's going to be hard for the the Giants to find running room with Saquon Barkley against this run defense for Philadelphia. May force them to have to throw a little bit more. Maybe they force Eli Manning to beat them this week. That's kind of why I think these guys have a safe floor. Maybe not a super high ceiling, but a decent floor. I mean, the Eagles go up over 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So it's not like they're a shutdown, secondary by any means. Now, for the Eagles, I mean, there's one guy, right? I mean, it's basically just Alshon Jeffrey. He looks to be back and healthy, had a huge week 13, and I expect a little bit more this week. We know that secondary can be had for the New York Giants, and there's really nobody else to get the ball to other than Alshon Jeffrey at this point. Zach Ertz banged up. Dallas Goedert hasn't produced a whole lot. Nelson Aguilar, T-Rex arms, can't catch any balls. I mean, there's all kinds of other issues there. Alshon Jeffrey's the one guy I'm taking a shot on here in week 14. All right, those are all my starts and sits for Week 14 fantasy football for the wide receiver position. Hopefully that was able to help you make a few decisions for your team here this week. We're also going to have rankings videos coming out here on Friday, so make sure you're watching out for those if you have other questions. Try to get those all in there before the weekend to give you guys as much opportunity as possible to get all those tough lineup decisions made. Hopefully we're able to help. If we are, make sure you hit that like button. We greatly appreciate the support. Pulling for everybody this week. Hopefully you guys go out there, advance in the playoffs, and bring home some more championships here in 2019.